Welcome, everyone. I'd like to go ahead and get started. Today's webinar is the basics on greenhouse gases. Welcome. This program is brought to you by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Printing Charter, which includes the Green Tier Program, SGP, the Association Roll-to-Roll Converters, the Flexographic Technical Association, Great Lakes Graphics Association, Printing United Alliance, and TLMI. My name is Joe Lyman. I'm the president of Great Lakes Graphics Association, and I represent printers throughout the state of Wisconsin. A little bit about webcast logistics today. All attendants are muted. If you have a question or comment, you can always use the chat feature in the side frame of the software system. I will unmute myself and ask that to the presenter. And also, you can always wait until the end of the webinar to be able to ask questions yourself. This webcast is being recorded and it will be provided to you in the next few days. And when we do email you the recording, we'll also provide you with some additional information. If I could, right now, I'd like to ask Gary Jones to talk about the double benefits of the bridge between the Green Tier program and the SGP program. Gary?
All right, thank you, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today. We're very excited about our presentation on greenhouse gas emissions. It is a very timely topic because it's really becoming very popular, especially with some recent activity by the SEC and the state of California. So, but what I really wanted to do here is talk a little bit about the Green Tier program and the Sustainable Green Printing Partnership. There are two programs that work together with each other. They're actually independent, separate programs, but we have worked with the Wisconsin DNR and the Green Tier to align the SGP program so that you can basically jump between both the programs. In other words, if you get certified under SGP, you can easily become recognized under Green Tier. And also under Green Tier, you can pretty much easily get recognized or certified under the Sustainable Green Printing Partnership. Each of the programs have, I think, very strong outcomes and recognition for companies, especially, of course, those in Wisconsin, which is our primary audience. Under the Green Tier program, you get a dedicated Wisconsin DNR liaison, which is critically important to help navigate both regulatory and sustainability resources available through the state. There's opportunities for regulatory flexibility and streamline permits, because if you're recognized under Green Tier, you're actually saying I'm a company committed to going beyond compliance. And so it is a fantastic program. And likewise, under the Sustainable Green Printing Partnership, that's actually a certification program that was developed pretty much by the printing industry, and it's for the printing industry. It's an independent nonprofit organization. It has a set of criteria. And if you go through the certification process, you're able to be recognized as a sustainable green printer. And I think probably the most important, one of the most, I would say, critical benefits of SGP is that you are able to use what's called the impact tracker. And the impact tracker really becomes a way for you to organize your sustainability program, keep track of what's going on, and most importantly, keep track of your metrics because your metrics are going to be very important. And it gives you a way to share your metrics and share the good story with your stakeholders. So with that being said, Joe, I'll turn it back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gary. And I encourage each one of you to seriously look at Green Tier / SGP program. Certainly, a lot of your customers are asking you for more information about your sustainability practices. And this is a great model way or standard way for you to be able to address that issue in a very straightforward way. So again, I encourage you to seriously look at the benefits of Green Tier / SGP program. Today's speaker is Katrina Saucier. Welcome, Katrina. She is a senior sustainability program manager at Green to Sustainable, which provides comprehensive data solutions for managing building and fleet performance metrics. For the past 10 years, she has worked with ever-evolving data requirements of customers to design and implement data-driven consulting, and management solutions that provide value. She designed and developed the SGP Impact Tracker, which is the web application that supports the high-performing sustainability certification standards of the Sustainable Green Print Partnership. She's a graduate of Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs with a master's degree in environmental sciences and earned her undergraduate degree in chemical engineering from the University of Maine. Welcome, Katrina.
Thank you so much, Joe. It is a pleasure to be here, truly. If you could go ahead in the slides. I have to tell you, having this discussion is probably one of my favorite things to do because I feel like knowledge is power. And I feel like there's such disconnect these days around carbon footprint and what that means because I never learned about this in school. I graduated, with my master's 15 years ago. So studying up through school and middle school and high school and in college, I never heard the word greenhouse gases. So it's really understandable that the working group of individuals, other than, kids who are just coming out of college, never got this basic understanding of what this is. I now read my kids, the Magic School Bus climate change book. Those books did not exist when we were kids. Maybe there's some very young folks on this call, but we don't just magically know what this is. And so I feel like getting this background and getting this basic fundamentals help create that connection from human activity to carbon footprint and quantifying it, because that's what we're really talking about when it comes to climate change and reducing our carbon footprint. Next slide, please. So today I really want to give that 50,000 foot view. I want to give a high level overview of what greenhouse gases are, common acronym GHGs, why it's called carbon and not the greenhouse gas footprint or not the nitrous oxide footprint, why it's important and how it's linked to climate change. Also get into some of this alphabet soup that the sustainability sector loves with the acronyms of GWP and CO2 equivalents. Then jump into what are scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. If anybody was following the Security Exchange and the newest announcement they made around climate disclosure and reporting on scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions. We'll directly address that today, as well as discuss what's a great place to start when it comes to carbon reduction goals, and then what's available to help you manage this process. Because at the end of the day, it's about working hard to do better, to waste less, to do more with less. And that really is the overall goal of sustainability in general. Next slide. So when we talk about greenhouse gases, I really like to think about when I was young in the 80s or 90s, I don't even remember which decade, there was the ozone crisis, right? The CFCs and hydrofluorocarbons were degrading our ozone. Scientists measured it, they identify it. And though hydrofluorocarbons weren't seen as like a pollutant like smog or particulate matter, something that directly harmed humans, it was seen as a pollutant because it harmed the environment, which then eventually harmed humans. And that's exactly the same with GHGs, with greenhouse gases. Next slide. They are a form of air pollution. And what this means is that they have scientifically been proven to trap heat. And that previous picture that you saw is probably one of my biggest aha moments when I was trying to really wrap my head around greenhouse gases and what this means. How do you prove something traps heat? And so in 1856, yes, 1856, Eunice Newton Foote actually did a science experiment where she had two beakers. She put some thermometers in those beakers. She filled one with just regular air, so just capped it. And then the other, she pushed out regular air and filled it with carbon dioxide, left them in the windows and watched the thermometers once she closed the shade. So it heated up, the air heated up in both beakers. She closed the shade, so now they weren't exposed to heat anymore or to the sunlight. And she saw and scientifically documented that the beaker with CO2 held heat longer. The temperature stayed higher longer than the beaker with just air. And this was the beginning of climate science. There are other types of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the one we talk about the most regularly. Nitrous oxide, also known as laughing gas, and is also commonly part of fertilizer use. There's methane, of course, which is from rotting food or other areas where they're releasing gas, particularly around like refineries. And then, of course, hydrofluorocarbons, so the gases we use as refrigerants. And what's really interesting is to understand that all of these different compounds, elemental compounds, have different abilities to trap heat. And so ultimately, these gases got called greenhouse gases because they cause the greenhouse effect, which means that just like with your car on a cool sunny day, heat is able to come through those windows because they're clear. And so those greenhouse gases create that layer in the atmosphere and it allows the heat to come in, but those windows don't allow the heat to go out. It holds in the heat. And that's exactly what these greenhouse gases do. They hold in the heat. Next slide, please. So I just mentioned a lot of different greenhouse gases. Why do we call it the carbon footprint, right? We're not calling it the nitrous oxide footprint. And that is because in terms of this pollution, greenhouse gas pollution, carbon dioxide makes up 80% of this pollution. It's still very important to control those other elements, but carbon dioxide makes up the bulk of those emissions and the bulk of how the greenhouse gas effect is impacting our planet. And this is because we're fundamentally changing the elemental composition of air, right? We have a mix of nitrogen, a mix of oxygen, a mix of carbon, but now we're adding a lot more different elements of different types that now are changing how our atmosphere works. Next slide, please. And so why is carbon so prevalent? Why is that such a big deal? Why is it such a big thing? And that is because the carbon cycle is the major fundamental piece of nature, of organic chemistry. Carbon is a fundamental building block. And so as part of our Earth and our planet and how it's evolved over the last billions of years, it's a cycle. There's a carbon cycle of where the amount of carbon stays the same on our Earth. It stays the same. Carbon is never destroyed. It only changes state from a gas to a solid to a liquid. As a gas, it's CO2. As a liquid, it's fossil fuel. As a solid, it could be a tree. This carbon is always there. It's just how it changes over time, its physical state in terms of how it impacts our environment. And over the last 50 years, we humans have also changed how we use products made from carbon, which has caused an elemental shift in our atmosphere and its composition. Next slide, please. So as we do this business activity, as we burn trees to heat our homes, as we put gasoline in our car, how does this impact our carbon footprint? And I think this is a fundamental piece that people really don't get, because we say carbon footprint, we don't call it a consumption footprint, because our carbon footprint is directly linked to our consumption footprint, which is about the materials we use and consume in our daily lives. And I think having it not be one direct relation, it just makes it more complicated and difficult to understand. But there's also extraordinary value in this carbon footprint and performing that calculation. Next slide. So luckily, we have our dear friends over at the World Resource Institute. This is a very well-known, well-recognized international nonprofit that worked with a great deal of scientists to write a methodology, to write a standard protocol for calculating carbon footprint. And this is commonly called the greenhouse gas protocol. And so there's some links at the end of this presentation that you can go to. But ultimately, it helps break down and identify that activity that creates carbon, that creates greenhouse gas emissions, and how to calculate the resulting footprint of that activity. Next slide. And ultimately, what they have done is written this simple mathematical equation of you have your activity. So, for example, burning electricity, consuming electricity, excuse me. That's an activity. I turn on my light, that light is now consuming electricity. A certain amount of greenhouse gases were created to make that electricity. They had to burn coal to generate that electricity at the power plant. They may have it may have come from windmills to generate that electricity, or it may be from a solar panel. So my activity is consuming electricity, and I am consuming kilowatts hours of electricity. And then there is what's called an emission factor. So luckily, we have a lot of scientists who are looking into how much carbon or greenhouse gases are emitted based on that activity. It could be recycling paper. It could be driving my car. All the business activity, what is the emissions associated with that? And they publish emission factors. So you multiply that business activity by the emission factor, and that quantifies that footprint. And then you can figure out what that means over a certain span of time in terms of how you're defining that boundary for your footprint. Next slide, please. And so as you hear, a key piece to calculating your footprint are these emission factors. So our dear friends over at the EPA, at the Center for Corporate Climate Leadership, publish every year, these emission factors. And this is actually really helpful, I find, because I am a dork, to go through this and look at the CO2 content of all these different items. And this is actually how you can start to even understand your own footprint and how certain business activity changes in different ways, like whether you are on a long haul flight versus a short haul flight. These have different emission factors based on the efficiency of the plane. So it's actually kind of interesting to go through this file and see the different business activities and what that CO2 factor is, methane factor, nitrous oxide factor, etc. And that's where it's quantifying the amount of CO2, the amount of GHGs per MMBTU, which is a unit of heat. So in this instance, they're talking about burning fuel and how it's emitting heat. And then quantifying the GHGs associated with that amount of fuel that was burned. Next slide, please. So one of the most complicated pieces about getting that emission factor is electricity, right? We have different electricity grids throughout the US, throughout the world, and they're not all the same. They burn different fuels to generate their electricity. So one great thing the EPA does is ask each different utility grid. And that's what you see here, where you see AKGD, excuse me. That's, I believe, for Alaska, the Alaskan grid. And they ask them, what types of fuels do you use to generate your electricity? And they break it down based on gas, coal, nuclear, hydro, and other sorts of fuel types. Then they use that previous file that you saw, or maybe other more sophisticated ways to say, okay, well, if you use this much gas plus this much coal plus this much hydro, this is what your carbon footprint is. So it's really important when you calculate your carbon footprint for where you live, it's based off of the grid, depending on where you live. Especially because there's an extraordinarily different generation mix. As you see, this is a very dynamic bar graph in terms of a different fuel mix across the US. One thing to also know, and I have found this to be extraordinarily confusing for some of our clients, but these fuel mixes include renewable. So there have been times when clients ask their utility to buy renewable electricity, and the utility will reply, well, don't worry, you're already consuming renewable electricity through just by using electricity off their grid. And technically that's true. But usually when a client is asking to buy renewable power, they're hoping to get specifically sourced renewable power. And so in carbon accounting, if your utility purchases 30% hydro, you cannot reduce your carbon footprint by 30% because that reduction in GHGs has already been included in this emission factor. And I know it sounds very confusing, but long story short, if you are looking to purchase or reduce your footprint through renewable electricity sources, look for sources that are from either hydro, wind, or other separate generation plants beyond what you're getting from the grid, without increasing your regular utility purchase. Next slide, please. So I've been talking a lot about carbon, nitrous oxide, and all these different GHGs, but how do we turn it into a more comprehensive value? And how do we make sure to calculate an accurate value when it comes to understanding carbon dioxide and methane and other GHGs without it being, 5 different numbers? How can we do it in one cohesive, comprehensive carbon footprint, one value? Next slide. And that's where GWP and carbon dioxide equivalents come into play. So with all these different gases that we've identified as pollutants that can hold heat, they have been tested to understand and quantify their ability to hold heat. So for example, we have carbon dioxide, and it's at a value of 1. So it actually has the lowest ability to hold heat compared to the other types of greenhouse gas pollutants. Methane, for example, has the ability to hold gas 25 times more than carbon dioxide. And so this is called a global warming potential. So if I have one molecule of methane, of CH2, that's equivalent to 25 molecules of CO2. So as you see, particularly with hydrofluorocarbons, where some of them have the global warming potentials of up to 15,000 times one molecule of CO2, these have the ability, even though they're not very prevalent in our atmosphere, they have the ability to have huge impacts. And so when we look at the different values, we now want to equate all these different types of greenhouse gases into one unified unit of carbon dioxide equivalents. Next slide, please. And that's what we call carbon dioxide equivalents. And so this is converting all the different greenhouse gases into one unified unit in the unit of carbon dioxide equivalents. Common unit are metric tons. And this is how it's measuring the volume of carbon dioxide equivalents. But then we even see other equations, including number of cars, or gallons of gasoline, or number of trees. So we can start to talk about carbon in different ways and use different units to help people understand what sort of impacts their business activity is having on the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So now that we understand greenhouse gases as a form of pollution, and we understand it's linked to business activity, how do we calculate it? How do we quantify it? And how do we summarize this performance. And this is where scope 1, 2, and 3 come into play. Next slide, please. And this is diagrammed directly from the GHG protocol. This is one of my favorite infographics. I use it all the time because I'm a very visual person. It really helps me to see what business activity the World Resources Institute has decided is worth quantifying. Luckily, humans breathing out carbon dioxide did not make this infographic. They identified a lot more different types of business activity that have more relevance and a lot more impact. So scope 1 is the most immediate way you can impact your greenhouse gas emissions within your organization because they are direct. They are the natural gas that you burn to heat your water. You have a chimney stack and the carbon is emitted through that stack. It's also the gasoline that's burned in your vehicles that your company purchases. These are, this is your organization purchasing this fuel and burning this electricity. So those are the most direct impacts you have, and that's called scope 1. Interestingly enough, if it's a dentist, they would start including nitrous oxide because that's laughing gas. Oftentimes, dentists use nitrous oxide to help with procedures. So they would consider that in their scope 1. Scope 2, you would look at purchased energy, including steam, electricity, and heating or cooling water from a public utility. Though this is indirect, it is a value that you can accurately capture as well as then calculate your scope 2 emissions for. And so again, this is what you're directly consuming in your electricity in your facility, but it's considered indirect because you are not generating the electricity on site. Then we have our scope 3, the infamous scope 3. And actually, just to jump back, scope 1 and 2 were the 2 scopes that were included in the security exchange disclosure that just happened. So it's a really well-defined and a value that your company can quantify based on its consumption. Then we have the infamous scope 3. And that includes everything else up and down the value chain of what it takes to run your business, from your employees to getting to work, purchasing your supplies, as well as transportation and distribution of your product and what happens to your product when it's in the landfill. And of course, all of these have greenhouse gases associated with them, and it's a result of your business activity, but it's not a direct result. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about carbon emissions, quantifying, it's about looking at your business activity and then quantifying it, but you're ultimately doing that to reduce your electricity, to reduce your carbon footprint. And that is where I am a huge supporter of SMART goals. And I think that's where also sustainability can feel a little overwhelming because there's so many things that you can do or so many different projects to work on. But when you start looking at SMART goals, it really allows your team to move forward in an effective and productive way. When you look at a specific area that you would like to improve, something that can have a measurable outcome, it's attainable, as well as relevant and time-based. And this allows you to set a very specific goal, a continuous improvement project, to really work towards reducing consumption, which then ultimately reduces your carbon footprint. One of the more popular nonprofits that have been widely recognized for its guidance on setting targets is the Science Based Targets Initiative. Please, next slide, please. And what they have done is taking a science-based approach on providing a recommendation of what your target should look like, right? I'm sure all of you are thinking, well, how do I set a target? A target's great, but how do I set it? And this is where Science-Based Target Initiative has outlined it. You need to reduce your scope 1 and 2 emissions by 30% by 2030 to keep warming below 2 degrees centigrade. Then we have another target here to reduce only by 1.5. So you really have, depending on what your team can achieve, those are just great guides in terms of reducing consumption. And this is to really try and prevent um, catastrophic global warming. So sounds like a lot of math, sounds like a lot of numbers, sounds like a lot of data collection. Can we do this? And this is where the SGP Impact Tracker or the Sustainability Dashboard comes into play. These are SaaS, they're web-based tools where you enter this data. And on the back end, all of these GHG coefficients have been included. And so as you look at your electricity trends or your natural gas consumption trends, you can drive improvements, right? That's how you think about this information. But then also on the back end, you can click the carbon accounting tab and it calculates what that carbon footprint is and helps you see what impacts those have. And it really actually helps your team also strategize to go where you'll have the biggest impact first and get the biggest results, especially when it comes to something like natural gas or with electricity. To move towards, potentially renewable sources or to look into reducing and avoiding consumption in the first place. Next slide, please. And so as I mentioned, we have the SGP Impact Tracker. It's a great tool to help perform those calculations. You can have a very rudimentary and headache-inducing approach through Excel. And then there is a perfectly free system, Energy Star Portfolio Manager. It will provide you the footprint of your building. So if you have vehicles, it will not provide that footprint, but it is a great tool for free. If you go to Energy Star Portfolio Manager, you can actually start footprinting your facility and understanding what your footprint is. Next slide, please. So if your team is really looking into understanding this and what it means in terms of your business, I would recommend first review the methodology for calculating GHGs. The GHG protocol has a lot of case studies, a lot of business specific examples that are just so helpful to read through and understand how other people are thinking about this, how they're using the information, how they're reasoning through imperfections in data, because that will always happen. And getting that input is really helpful. And then, of course, use that methodology to calculate your footprint and identify what those main contributors are. Then you can use that as a way to responsibly set targets and see how your team can meet them. And then, of course, it's about generating interest, generating excitement, generating enthusiasm around doing better. And oftentimes that starts with a green team or a sustainability steering committee. But at the end of the day, really, it's something that everybody within your organization should be working towards. Next slide, please. And with that, I would like to open the floor to questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Katrina. Excellent webinar. So we do have a few questions. My company hasn't started with calculating their footprint. How do we start?
Excellent question. I didn't mention where do you get your data from, right? So it starts with your utility invoices, your natural gas invoices, your electricity invoices, and capturing the consumption. How much kilowatt hours you consume, not kilowatts. Kilowatt hours are two very different numbers. And performing that calculation. You can do some research in terms of which methodology you would like to use. I would recommend bringing on experts like Green to Sustainable to help you with that process, only because at the end of the day, it's about resource management. And trying to muddle through, you'll get there. I know you will. You're a highly talented individual, but if it's not something you do every day, it's going to take 10 to 15 times as long. Whereas working with individuals who do this on a regular basis, can have you up and running, can have a year historical footprint within a couple weeks. And so it really just takes the onus off spending your time figuring this all out to actually now using that resource, which is time, to now really drive improvements and reduce consumption. And that's where the payoff is in terms of spending less on your utilities. And that's where, again, sustainability has an amazing opportunity to pay off, especially when you really start to consider rates and how they're only going up.
Excellent. Here's another question. How do you source low carbon electricity?
Mm. So here's one thing that is pretty tricky about the sustainability industry and the carbon industry. It's completely unregulated. So, well, California is attempting to, but in terms of the carbon, in terms of RECs, it's unregulated. And I have been seeing a lot of interesting approaches in terms of carbon rights and solar panels, and even customers accidentally selling or signing away their carbon rights on a contract without realizing it, because they didn't know that their solar panels and their KW could be separated from the carbon benefits of that KWH. And so I highly recommend first focusing on avoiding consumption, then reducing consumption, then retrofitting to further reduce consumption, and then looking into renewable power. The first place I go are utilities and purchase renewable power through utility programs, because though the REC market, the third-party REC market, is not regulated, utilities are highly regulated. And so there's a lot more accountability, there's a lot more due diligence. There are a lot of checks and balances in place to make sure that one, that KWR, that renewable power, actually exists, that two, it's not being double sold, and two and three, it's actually being consumed. And there are programs like in Maine, where I live, there's a community solar program where the state is creating utility-based RECs that are purchased through the utility by constructing solar farms for residential use, because most times residents don't want to pay. They're not worried about their carbon footprint as much, but they're the ones signing up to use that power, which is then the carbon benefits are being sold to businesses to reduce their footprint. And so this business plan is financing the construction of this solar plant to then move towards a lower carbon electricity, which wouldn't exist if this sort of market of carbon and RECs wasn't there.
Excellent. How do carbon offsets help?
So similar to RECs, carbon offsets are not regulated. There are voluntary markets where they have defined methodologies and protocols. I don't, at this point in time, recommend to any of my clients to purchase offsets for a couple reasons. One, even though some of them have been working on this for 5, 10, 15 years, they're still not there yet. There's still work to do in-house to reduce, because that's where you really get a result when it comes to reducing a carbon footprint, right? You just aren't using that electricity, so that piece of wood isn't being burned, so that carbon isn't in the atmosphere. Of course, that's not the one all, save all, be all. And so the option of investing in a solar farm, or investing in a project that sequesters carbon, or investing in a tree plantation that also will sequester carbon, those are in a very rudimentary way to describe carbon offsets. And they claim they've been verified, although I've read, sometimes that's not truly the case. And so for me right now, I really have my clients talk about their ultimate goal in terms of reducing their footprint and why they want to use offsets as a mechanism. In terms of applying it to your footprint, that is the most widely accepted way to do it. However, I feel like it's a lot more advantageous for a company to invest in a local land trust by donating $20,000, $100,000 to this land trust, and to purchase and protect a piece of land, because that equally has benefits. It may not have a minted certified carbon offsets, but that still has value. And it's a way of keeping that investment local. It's a way of having more accountability, more due diligence, more transparency, which I just don't see in third-party offsets. Um, in some of them, that's a very general statement, but I think, for me, I prefer for that and for those investments to stay local. And I think they have a better payoff and a more direct payoff in terms of my local community.
Excellent.
Any other questions?
How do you identify which scope 3 emission source apply to your facility?
Yeah, so it really is about going through the different categories. So if you go into the GHG protocol, they actually have a whole special manual just on scope 3 and supply chain. And it really is about going through that manual and seeing which items apply. There are some that you look at and you know, no, we don't lease any assets, so that does not apply to us. There are others that are a little more confusing around like electricity distribution. That mainly would have to be with like a utility. However, there is line loss, so there can be a line loss factor added to the electricity you consume to account for that. And then really, of course, there's the supply chain, that we all none of us live in the bubble, so everybody has a supply chain that they depend on to manufacture or to provide their services. And so that definitely does apply. So it's really about using the GHG protocol scope 3 guide and going through each one of those to see if it does and doesn't apply. And I strongly recommend doing this in writing and documenting the reasoning behind why it is included or why it's not included. And that really just provides best practice and documentation behind how that reasoning was achieved. And that helps a great deal in terms of institutional knowledge. It helps you maybe eventually revisit it if things may have changed in your business and now you are leasing facilities.
Excellent. What are the most impactful steps or actions you can take to reduce your carbon footprint?
I think the first is quantifying it, because that's where you can see where the biggest impactful steps are. That's where should I focus on natural gas or should I focus on my fleet? Should I focus on my electricity? And by focusing on where your biggest emissions are first will result in the biggest impact, especially if you're able to reduce those.
Excellent. Finally, I understand there's a lot of controversy associated with carbon offsets. What is the issue with them?
They're just not regulated. There is no actual written regulation. Other than what we see coming out of California. So there's Vera, there's the American Carbon Registry. This is all voluntary. So it's expecting the industry to regulate itself, which I think is very dangerous. And it is quite honestly a very weak link within, I think, the sustainability industry right now. It's I think it's actually counterintuitive to what sustainability really stands for, which is transparency and accountability. Because a lot of times these registries don't necessarily operate the way or the way, when an organization purchases a credit, how those funds are distributed through the registry and the carbon broker, and then to the final project. And none of that is clearly defined when you just go to a regular registry. There are very high quality offsets out there. I know some, I recommend some. And that is because I personally know the individual working on them. I know where these projects are. I know how they're brokered. And in order to purchase them responsibly, that level of due diligence is highly recommended.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate your time today, Katrina. A fantastic webinar. And again, if there's any questions that anyone has, certainly we are sending out information here in the near future. You're always welcome to ask as a response to that email.